Hi there. Tonight we slip quietly into a world where thunder has not yet been born, where the sky is silent and waiting, and where the fate of gods is hidden in a cave on the rugged island of Crete. You can almost feel the cool stone beneath your bare feet and hear the hush of the sea pressing against the cliffs. And somewhere, just out of sight, a newborn stirs who will one day claim the sky itself. But for now he's wrapped up like any other baby, except that his cries could shake mountains if someone doesn't muffle them fast enough. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far our little community stretches across the world, and if there are any myths or fairy tales you'd love to hear in a future episode, drop it in the comments below. Now, let's begin our quiet journey. Zeus, not yet the booming, lightning-throwing ruler of Olympus, but a small, almost fragile secret. His story does not start in a golden throne room, but in shadows, whispered among dripping stalactites and guarded by dancers with clashing shields. The world into which he was born was not kind to children of prophecy. There was a certain problem with his father, Cronus, a mighty titan whose parenting style could be politely described as snack-based discipline. Every time one of his children was born, he would promptly eat them, whole. No salt, no olive oil, just straight down the hatch. One can only imagine family dinners, awkward silence, plenty of chewing, and his wife Rhea quietly seething while pretending to stir the stew. Rhea, the long-suffering mother, had grown tired of watching her children vanish one by one into her husband's stomach. Hera, Hestia, Demeter, Poseidon, Hades, all gone. The nursery was empty, but Cronus's belly was very full indeed, and when she discovered she was pregnant again, something in her snapped. You can picture her pacing through the palace, her sandals brushing against polished stone floors, her robes whispering like restless curtains, and muttering to herself, "Not this one, no more." Even the statues seemed to lean forward, listening to her determination. And so, when the time came, she fled to Crete, an island shrouded in mystery, its mountains rough and proud, the sea around it dark and glittering like a cloak of secrets. There, in a cave tucked into Mount Ida, she brought her child into the world. The air in that cave must have been cool and damp, the smell of earth heavy and raw, shadows dancing along the walls as torches sputtered, and in her arms lay a baby who would one day split the skies with thunder. But right now he was pink, wriggly, and in desperate need of a lullaby. The problem: babies cry. And when your father is a paranoid titan with a tendency to swallow first and ask questions never, a crying baby is a terrible liability. So Rhea enlisted help, the curates, a group of warriors with a flair for the dramatic. Their job? To dance wildly around the cave, clashing their bronze shields together and stomping their feet. The idea was simple. If the baby cried, the noise of the curates would cover it. Of course, to the neighbours, it must have sounded like a never-ending drum circle fueled by too much wine. There's something almost comic about it. Imagine a tiny child fussing in a cradle made of golden boughs, while grown men in heavy armour leap and spin like overeager uncles at a wedding. Yet it worked, and the secret of Crete remained hidden. Life in that cave was not glamorous. No golden halls, no silk cradles, just rough stone, the smell of goats, and a baby with a future too large to fit into the walls around him. He was fed by the goat Amalthea, whose milk nourished him with a strength unlike any mortal child. Amalthea herself seemed oddly proud of her unusual babysitting duty. One could almost imagine her gossiping with other goats. Oh yes, Mine is special. Thunder in his lungs and lightning in his eyes. What's yours done? Chewed grass? How quaint. The nymphs too watched over him, tender hands soothing his rest, weaving him blankets of softest wool. They must have whispered to him in the quiet nights, when the wind blew through the cracks of the cave like an uninvited ghost. Perhaps they told him stories of the stars or of the sea that forever kissed the shores below. His world was small, yet already it was brimming with prophecy. Even as an infant, there was a sense of destiny hovering in the cave like incense smoke, a weight pressing on the air. The Titans ruled the cosmos, yes, but they ruled in fear, in hunger, in suspicion. Cronus himself sat upon his throne like a man forever checking over his shoulder. He had heard the prophecy. One of his children would overthrow him, and in trying to prevent it, he had guaranteed it. For what parent devours their child and expects loyalty in return? Years passed, and the boy grew. His laughter echoed in the cave, his footsteps quickened on the rough stone floors, his strength swelling with each passing day. The curettes continued their noisy dancing, sometimes more for tradition than necessity. The goat Amalthea watched proudly, though she often had to headbutt him away from pulling on her horns. There was something charmingly mischievous about him. He had a habit of climbing rocks he shouldn't, stealing figs from baskets, and laughing with a sound that startled the birds into flight. Yet always there lingered that tension. The secret must remain, for if Cronus discovered him, all would be lost. But secrets are rarely safe forever. Far away, in the palaces of the Titans, Cronus grew uneasy. He could feel it in the pit of his very stomach, perhaps literally, considering he had 5 children rolling around inside him like unwanted dinner guests. His paranoia sharpened. He questioned Rhea, watched her too closely. His hand would tighten on his sickle whenever he saw her slip away for too long. Rhea, however, had mastered the art of the innocent smile. She played part of the dutiful wife, all while her heart remained tethered to the cave in Crete. And there, the child learned. He learned the songs of the sea, the taste of olives, the rhythm of dancing shields. He learned patience, for caves are not generous with distractions. He learned secrecy, for every day was borrowed, fragile, dangerous. And he learned hope. Hope is a strange thing. It can sit quietly, like a seed in the dark, waiting for the right moment to split the earth and reach for the sun. In that cave, hope grew alongside the boy, until the walls themselves could not contain it. One night, as the wind screamed across the mountains and the sea battered the cliffs with furious hands, the nymphs whispered that the time was nearing. He could feel it too, like a storm pressing on the horizon, waiting to break. He was no longer a boy to be hidden, but a force ready to rise. He stood at the mouth of the cave now, no longer the hidden child of shadows, but a youth with strength in his shoulders and a brightness in his eyes that seemed older than his years. The wind that whipped across Mount Ida tugged at his hair and whispered of the vast world beyond Crete. It spoke of kingdoms trembling, of titans gnawing at their own fears, of a throne balanced on suspicion alone, and in that wind he felt the stirrings of his future. He had grown restless in the safety of stone walls and goat's milk. The cave had sheltered him, but caves are not meant to be forever. Even the earth itself seemed to sigh at his footsteps as though urging him outward. The nymphs who had tended him began to look at him differently too, no longer as a babe in need of lullabies, but as someone whose stride would carry him into history. They often sat near the firelight, weaving garlands or stirring honey into bowls, and they would glance at him with a mixture of pride and apprehension, for they knew that sooner or later he would step into a dangerous destiny. The Crete still danced and clashed their shields, but sometimes, when they grew tired, they looked at him as if to say, "You know, perhaps you can make your own thunder now." And he would smile quietly, because he knew they were right. In secret, he began to test himself, lifting stones heavier than any shepherd could move, running along the cliffs until the gulls themselves seemed unable to keep pace, leaping across gorges with reckless joy. Each moment was a rehearsal for a role the world had not yet seen, and yet, beneath the triumph of growing strength lay a constant shadow, the knowledge that his father still ruled, a father who swallowed his children as though they were figs picked too soon from the tree, a father who had no throne strong enough to hold his fear. The thought of it gnawed at him in the night, when the cave was still and the embers glowed faintly like sleeping eyes. Sometimes he dreamt of that Titan's great hand reaching into the cave, searching blindly for him. Sometimes he awoke with the sound of bronze shields echoing in his ears, as though the TOURnet danced not in joy but in warning. He carried these dreams into his days, and they became fuel for something larger, not hatred exactly, but a sharp, simmering resolve. Meanwhile, far from Crete, Cronus continued his uneasy reign. The other Titans bent to his will, but their obedience was born of caution rather than loyalty. Even the air in his halls seemed heavy, as though weighed down by suspicion. His throne glittered, but his heart was restless. He could not escape the prophecy, no matter how many children he devoured. And sometimes he would touch his stomach and wonder if his own rebellion was already growing inside him. Rhea, ever the patient actress, endured his glances and his questions, but in her chest burned a secret satisfaction, for she alone knew that the child he feared was alive and thriving. When whispers reached her of a shepherd's goat that seemed oddly protective, or of shield-clashing dancers on the mountainside, she would turn her face away and pretend not to hear. Inwardly, though, her spirit lifted, for she knew the tide was slowly turning. On the island, the boy grew bolder still. He began to venture beyond the cave, wandering into villages where mortals lived their quiet, labouring lives. They did not know who he truly was, but they felt something in his presence. He walked among them like a shepherd's son, yet when he laughed it was as if the air itself grew lighter. When he helped them lift a fallen tree or guide their flocks, they whispered to one another, wondering at his strength. Perhaps they thought him blessed by the gods, not realizing he was the very God who would shape their heavens. And here, among simple lives, he learned something the Titans never understood. He learned the power of trust, of gratitude, of kindness exchanged without fear. He saw the way mortals shared bread even when they had little. He watched how mothers shielded their children even in hunger. He understood that strength was not merely the weight of stone one could lift, but the weight of burdens one could ease from another's shoulders. These lessons carved deeper marks in him than even the cliffs of Crete could show. But destiny rarely allows for peace too long. One night, as the moon hung like a silver coin above the mountains, the nymphs spoke again. Their voices were low, almost fearful, as they told him that the time had come. He could no longer hide in the folds of Crete. The prophecy could not remain buried in a cave forever, and he was the one who must fulfill it. He did not argue, though his heart pounded like hooves against the earth. He knew it was true. The years of secrecy had shaped him, but now action must shape the world. And so he left the cave. He walked away from the cradle of his childhood, past the sleeping warriors who once guarded his cries, past the goat who bleated mournfully at his back, past the fire where the nymphs watched him with tear-bright eyes. His sandals struck the earth with a new weight that night, the weight of a future stepping into place. The journey ahead would not be gentle. To challenge a titan was no small matter. The earth itself seemed to bristle at the thought. The rivers murmured uneasily, the stars looked down with curiosity, and the sea rolled restlessly as if waiting for some grand upheaval. He travelled in secret at first, cloaking himself in anonymity, but everywhere he went, stories began to trail after him like shadows. Stories of a youth who could wrestle a bull to the ground, who could leap cliffs with ease, who could speak with a voice that carried like distant thunder, and rumours. Well, rumours are like seeds on the wind. They always find a place to grow. Soon even the halls of Cronus began to hum with strange tales of a figure rising from the islands, and though the Titan dismissed them with a sneer, he could not quite silence the unease in his chest. Meanwhile, the youth sought allies. He knew he could not face the Titans alone. He sought wisdom from ancient powers, those who had lingered on the edges of creation long before the Titans carved their thrones. Some gave him counsel, speaking in riddles that drifted like smoke. Others offered him gifts, subtle tools that would prove their worth when the moment of reckoning arrived. And slowly, quietly, he began to weave a web of trust and preparation. It was not yet war, but it was no longer peace either. The world seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the thin edge of what was to come. He moved like a shadow, gathering strength, learning patience, honing his resolve. His eyes no longer looked only to the mountains of Crete, but to the horizon where storm clouds gathered. He could feel the storm in his blood, a storm that waited for release. And though he smiled, and though he laughed, there were moments when his gaze turned sharp, as if he could already see the sickle in his father's hand and the throne that must one day crumble. He was not yet the ruler of the sky, but the sky already seemed to lean toward him, listening. And somewhere in the depths of the palace of Cronus, a Titan stirred uneasily in his sleep. The Titan stirred uneasily in his sleep, and far away the youth who carried thunder in his blood pressed onward. For all his strength and restless determination, he knew that to simply storm into his father's hall would be folly. The Titans were ancient, colossal, woven into the very bones of the cosmos. Their breath alone could shake the air and their hands could move mountains. No, this would require patience, cunning, and a touch of theatre. Qualities that, fortunately, he'd been quietly collecting all along. He sought guidance from those who walked outside the dominion of Cronus, wise beings hidden in forgotten groves, in caves older than memory, in the hushed corners of the earth where even the Titans seldom lingered. Some told him cryptic riddles, some offered herbs and charms, and one in particular, a goddess of craft and quiet rebellion, slipped into his path. Her name was Metis, a daughter of Oceanus, and her mind was sharper than bronze. She did not move with the heavy arrogance of Titans, but with a fluid grace, a knowing smile that always seemed 2 steps ahead. She looked upon him and saw not only the youth who had once hidden in a cave but the storm waiting to be born, and she said softly, "If you wish to defeat one who swallows all things, you must give him something that will turn against him from within." Her words coiled through him like a whisper of lightning. Together they fashioned a plan, not to strike with raw force, but to trick, to unmake the Titan's feast from the inside out. For what Cronus had devoured could be forced back into the light if only the right potion could churn his insides with irresistible rebellion. The thought alone was deliciously ironic. A titan undone not by sword or spear but by his own stomach. Meanwhile, Cronus brooded in his golden hall, pacing the cold stone floors, the air thick with suspicion. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Every whisper clung too long to his ear. He drank deeply of wine to silence his unease, but even wine turned sour on his tongue. He suspected something, though he did not know what. He suspected Rhea most of all, for her eyes still held secrets she would not speak. Sometimes he dreamed of a figure standing against him, and when he woke his mouth was bitter, as if the dream itself tasted of prophecy. Into this atmosphere of paranoia the youth stepped, not openly, but with careful timing. He cloaked himself in calm confidence, speaking to mortals and immortals alike, gathering rumors, weaving them into something larger. When at last he returned to the halls of the Titans, he did so not as a hidden child, but as a guest. His presence was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable. Cronus looked upon him with suspicion, though he did not yet guess the truth. He saw a stranger with clear eyes and strong hands, a figure who bowed politely but whose gaze did not bend. For a moment, perhaps, the Titan's heart stirred with the uneasy recognition that this guest carried a resemblance to his own blood. But he pushed it aside, unwilling to voice the thought that the prophecy might already stand before him. Meti, unseen in the shadows, slipped the potion into his goblet, a concoction of herbs bitter and sharp, a draught designed to twist and churn, to rattle even the gut of a Titan. Cronus lifted the cup, suspicious still, but pride is a blinding drink, and he swallowed deeply. The effect was immediate. A rumble began in his chest, not the dignified rumble of command, but the undignified rumble of regret. His stomach twisted, his throat convulsed, and before the startled eyes of his court he bent double. One by one, with cries that shook the hall, he disgorged the children he had once devoured. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon spilled forth, dazed and blinking, as if waking from a long nightmare. The hall that had echoed with Cronus's authority now rang with chaos. The Titans looked on in shock while the newly freed siblings gasped and clung to one another, bewildered but alive. And there, in the midst of the uproar, stood the youth who had once hidden in a cave. He looked upon his brothers and sisters with a quiet smile, as though to say, "I told you I would come." It was a reunion unlike any other. Imagine siblings meeting for the first time, not in a cozy home, but on the stone floor of a Titan's hall, still sticky with the echoes of being swallowed. Awkward, yes, but profoundly moving nonetheless. Cronus roared in fury, his voice like stone cracking under pressure. He seized his sickle, his eyes blazing with betrayal and wrath. In that moment, prophecy had blossomed into reality. The child he had feared, the child he had tried to destroy, stood before him with a new army at his side. And though the war was not yet fought, the balance of power had shifted forever. The air itself seemed to tense, the ground quivered beneath their feet. The Titans were no longer unchallenged. A storm had been born. The siblings gathered, trembling but resolute, their eyes darting between one another and then back to the figure who had freed them. He gave no long speeches, no grand declarations. He simply lifted his hand, calm and steady, as though to reassure them. They did not yet know the path ahead, but they knew they would walk it together. Outside the hall, the sky darkened. Clouds swirled as though echoing the turmoil below, and somewhere, far above, lightning flickered for the first time in an age. The war was not yet here, but its scent was in the air, sharp, metallic, inevitable. And in the stillness before the storm broke, the youth who had risen from the cave of Crete stood tall, his eyes meeting those of the Titan who had once called himself father. The hall trembled as Cronus rose, his sickle gleaming like a slice of moonlight sharpened into menace. His roar still echoed through the stone, vibrating in the ribs of every being present. And yet, against that sound stood the children he had tried so desperately to erase. They were still shaken, their limbs stiff from long confinement, their eyes wide as though the world itself was new again. But in their gazes flickered the first sparks of defiance. The youth, no longer hidden, no longer just a guest, stood at their side. He did not flinch at his father's wrath, nor did he bow as others had done. Instead, he met that fury with calm, as if watching a storm he'd been waiting for all his life. The other Titans shifted uneasily. Some drew closer to Cronus, their loyalty bound by fear and long habit. Others hesitated, for they had seen the impossible. Children returned from the depths, prophecy unfolding before their eyes. And hesitation in the court of a tyrant is already the seed of betrayal. Cronus thundered words that rattle like falling stones, condemning his children, vowing to crush them anew. But vows alone do not mend the cracks that destiny has carved. Already the air was different. Already the world leaned toward change. The siblings gathered in a quiet corner of the hall that night, whispering to one another in voices still hoarse from their strange rebirth. Hestia, the calm eldest, laid a steadying hand on her sisters. Demeter's eyes shone with fierce determination, while Hera's voice was sharp and questioning, demanding to know what path lay ahead. Hades sat brooding, his gaze shadowed yet burning with a cold resolve, and Poseidon's restless energy seemed ready to churn like the sea he would one day command. They turned to their liberator, their youngest brother, who seemed both familiar and strange, and in the firelight they saw in him the strength they needed. He told them softly that their father's time had ended, that the Titan's rule, built on fear and hunger, would not last, and that together they could reshape the cosmos. His words were not thunder yet, but they carried the steady rhythm of inevitability. Even in whispers, destiny can be louder than a roar. Of course, planning a war against the Titans was not a simple affair. The siblings were strong, but the Titans were colossal, ancient, woven into the very fabric of creation. To challenge them was to challenge the bones of the world itself. They needed allies, they needed weapons, and they needed courage that would not falter when the sky cracked with violence. So they began to seek help. They ventured into the deep places of the earth, where shadows pooled thick as tar, and there they found the Cyclopes, giant craftsmen with single blazing eyes, long imprisoned by the Titans in the darkness of Tartarus. The Cyclops blinked against the sudden light of freedom, their massive hands trembling as if unused to anything but chains. Yet when they looked upon the children who had freed them, gratitude welled in their hearts like fire. They swore allegiance, and in return they offered gifts that would shape the ages. To the youngest they gave the weapon of storm itself, a lightning bolt, alive with searing power, a jagged flame that could split the heavens. To Poseidon they gave the trident, three-pronged and restless, a symbol of seas unchained. And to Hades they granted the helm of darkness, a shadowy crown that could make its wearer unseen and feared even by death itself. These were not mere tools, but extensions of their very essence. Weapons that breathed with the fury of nature itself. The siblings stood taller with these gifts, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of power entrusted to them. Meanwhile, in the hidden folds of the earth, The 100-handed ones stirred, giants with limbs beyond counting, each hand a hammer, each arm a storm of its own. Forgotten, exiled, locked away by the cruelty of Cronus. They blinked awake as the children unbound them, and their laughter rolled like avalanches. With such allies, the balance no longer seemed impossible. The Titans still loomed vast and terrible, but the children now had a storm brewing at their backs. And so it began. The Titanomachy. 10 years of war that shook the very pillars of existence. 10 years in which mountains cracked, seas boiled, and the stars themselves seemed to tremble in their courses. Imagine the sky, torn by lightning as if the heavens were being rewritten with fire. Imagine the earth quaking so violently that rivers changed their paths and forests tumbled into the sea. Imagine the voices of gods and titans colliding, each word a thunderclap, each cry a crack in eternity. The battles raged across the cosmos. On one side stood the old guard, the Titans, massive and unyielding, led by Cronus with his sickle flashing like the blade of inevitability. On the other side stood the new generation, fierce, determined, armed with gifts of fire and shadow, their youth not weakness but fuel for courage. There were moments when the war seemed hopeless, moments when the Titans' sheer force pressed the children back, when even lightning faltered against the crushing weight of stone. But then the 100-handed ones would rise, hurling mountains as if they were pebbles, their laughter shaking valleys into dust. There were moments when despair flickered in mortal hearts, when they feared the sky itself would collapse upon them. But then a bolt would split the heavens, and the sight of it would kindle hope anew. The war was not only of strength but of endurance. 10 years of ceaseless struggle, 10 years of ash and thunder. Yet slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. The siblings grew into their powers, their movements more sure, their voices louder, their unity sharper. They were no longer a band of frightened fugitives. They were gods, and the world itself seemed to know it. Cronus fought with fury, his rage undimmed, but rage cannot bind what is already breaking. His sickle swung wide, but each time it was met with defiance by trident, by helm, by bolt of fire. By the end of the 10th year, the war reached its climax. The air was thick with smoke and fury. The ground cracked open to reveal glowing veins of fire. The Titans rallied desperately, their voices echoing like collapsing mountains. But the children pressed forward, relentless. In the final clash, thunder roared like never before. The sky itself seemed to split as the youngest hurled his lightning, searing through the darkness with a brilliance that blinded even the Titans. The bolt struck true, shaking Cronus to his core. His sickle clattered to the ground, ringing against stone like the final note of a broken song. And in that moment, the reign of the Titans crumbled. The children seized victory, not with ease, not without cost, but with the weight of destiny fulfilled. The Titans, defeated, were cast into the depths of Tartarus, bound with chains forged by the Cyclopes, guarded forever by the 100-handed ones. Their cries echoed into the abyss, fading into silence, while above, the air grew lighter, as though the world itself exhaled after holding its breath for ages. The siblings stood together on the battlefield, bruised, weary, but victorious. The storm had passed, and yet a new storm waited, one of decisions, of thrones, of what shape the future would now take. For victory is only the beginning of the rule, and the sky, the sea, and the underworld now stood waiting for voices to claim them. The battlefield lay in silence now. Ash still drifted like snow over broken stone, and the air was heavy with the fading echoes of roars that once split the heavens. The Titans were gone, bound deep in Tartarus, their cries swallowed by the abyss, and for the first time in an age the world felt strangely open, as though the very air had been cleared of a suffocating shadow. The siblings stood together, weary and stained with the dust of war, yet their eyes were bright with something more enduring than victory. They had survived, they had endured, and they had remade the order of existence itself. Yet as the storm quieted, another question arose, heavy as any mountain hurled in battle. Who now would rule, and how would they divide the vastness of creation? They gathered in council, not in the halls of Titans, but beneath the open sky, as though to let the stars themselves bear witness to their decisions. Each sibling carried the weight of their own essence, their own desire, and their own sense of what must be. Hestia, gentle and calm, desired no throne, for her heart longed only for hearths and the quiet warmth of home. She bowed gracefully and stepped aside, her strength meant for steadiness rather than dominion. Demeter spoke of fields, of harvests, of life that must now flourish free of terror, and she too asked not for crowns but for soil and seed, for the gentle cycle of growth that fed mortals and gods alike. Hera's eyes flashed with ambition, her voice sharp with authority, but she did not yet demand a throne for herself, for she watched carefully, waiting, always calculating how power would settle. The three brothers, however, could not step aside so easily, for the cosmos itself seemed to lean toward them as if waiting for its rulers to speak. They cast lots, not as gamblers but as heirs to a fractured world dividing its spoils. The sea, the sky, the underworld, each vast, each infinite, each a kingdom unto itself. The lots were drawn, their fate sealed not by preference but by chance, or perhaps by the quiet hand of destiny, which often disguises itself as luck. To Poseidon fell the sea, its waves restless and proud, its storms fierce, its depths filled with secrets that even gods could scarcely fathom. He accepted with a booming laugh, already feeling the salt wind on his face, already dreaming of kingdoms beneath coral and foam. To Hades fell the underworld, the deep shadowed realm beneath the earth where the dead must journey, a place of silence and mystery. His eyes darkened at the weight of it, yet he accepted without protest, for there was a certain gravity in him that matched the realm itself. And to the youngest fell the sky, the boundless expanse above, filled with clouds and stars and storms yet to be written. He lifted his gaze as though the heavens themselves had been waiting for his eyes, and in that moment the crown of lightning was his. The division was made, and each realm settled into its new ruler. Yet even in division there was unity, for the siblings had fought side by side, and the memory of war still bound them in a chain stronger than any iron forged by the Cyclopes. Still, it was the one who claimed the sky who now bore the mantle of supremacy, for the heavens touched all things, and the throne among the clouds cast its shadow across earth, sea, and underworld alike. His rule was not announced with blaring trumpets or carved decrees. It was felt in the quiet shift of the air, in the way thunder now rolled as if guided by a hand rather than chance, in the way the stars glittered as though winking in approval. Mortals lifted their eyes and sensed a new presence above them, not the cold weight of Titans, but the watchful strength of something different, something protective, if still unpredictable. The nymphs whispered in delight, remembering the boy they once cradled. The goat Amalthea, somewhere on the mountainside, bleated proudly to the other goats, who pretended to understand. Even the curettes danced once more, their shields clashing not to hide a child's cries, but to celebrate a storm now crowned. And high above, seated among drifting clouds, lightning at his side and the sky stretched endlessly before him, the youth who had risen from shadows of Crete at last became the ruler of gods and men. He did not forget the cave, nor the milk of a patient goat, nor the clashing of shields that kept him hidden. He did not forget the darkness of war, nor the faces of his siblings rising from his father's grasp. All of it lived within him, threads woven into the cloak of a king. The throne of the sky was not a seat of ease, but of endless watching, endless storms, endless choices. Yet in his heart he carried the quiet certainty that he had been shaped for this. The heavens stretched wide, and he was no longer their child, but their master. Still, on some nights, when the wind moved softly over the mountains of Crete, he would remember the cave where it all began, and he would smile at the thought that thunder itself had once been nothing more than the muffled cry of a hidden child.